So, second intro now. I'm Mark Seifter, and this is Arcane Mark. Welcome today to Arcane Mark Design Diary, where I'm going to be talking about Pathfinder Unchained. Pathfinder Unchained is a book that is near and dear to me because of the fact that it was the very first book that I ever worked on as a designer at Paizo. And when I say this, some people who have very sharp eyes, when I've said this before, have said, but wait, Mark, you're listed as a designer in Monster Codex and as an author. And that is true. When I was hired at Paizo 5 years ago, very, very soon, they were pretty much done Monster Codex. It was laid out, and if you saw the episode of what the process was, they were in the copy phase. And during that phase, it turned out that they really needed one more goblin that was probably some kind of an alchemist. And that is how the Goblin Sticky Lord got into Monster Codex, which I wrote and did maybe the least deserving amount of work for having an author credit in Monster Codex. Pathfinder Unchained, however, was really the first book that I legitimately got to start with and do a lot of things. I want to start off the bat by just thanking Jason and Logan and Steven, because I was the new guy at that time. I guess Logan had switched over to design recently too, but really he'd been in the industry for a long time, and all three of them could have easily just had me do busy work or not really had me contribute like weird new things. But every time I wanted to add something that was not in the outline, and the outline of which had already been ordered, and if you remember the process, once you order it, you've ordered it, well, they always said, that's a great idea, give it a shot. And they let me put a bunch of things in this book that they really didn't have to, and it made me feel very welcome. And some of those are things that I think a lot of you guys really like. So if it weren't for them just saying, yeah, new guy, go ahead, that sounds like a good idea, we'll figure it out, then a lot of those things could never have happened. So, alright, let's take a look at Pathfinder Unchained and all the different sections. I vaguely remember somewhat the order in which I worked on these, but not perfectly, and to make sure that I really go through these methodically, I'm going to go through from near the beginning till near the end. I might take some side tangents or connect things to other sections that are later on in the book. But if you're following along with your copy of Pathfinder Unchained, you can sort of see this as that DVD special commentary for Unchained. Alright, so the first thing in Unchained, and the thing that most people probably remember the most, especially if you're in organized play, where it's among the only things that are available in the book, are the classes for Unchained. Now, admittedly, being the new guy, the classes were not the main place where I was doing a lot of my work in the book. Mostly I was working on some of the other subsystems and sections. In particular, the Unchained Barbarian, I really didn't do pretty much anything on. And I usually have a little bit of a finger in almost everything. With the Unchained Barbarian, I did some quick checks of some of the rage powers, but overall, that was something Jason kind of took the lead on all three of the classes because, well, he designed all three of the original classes. He knew what he was looking for. And with the Barbarian, Logan was the main backstop, whereas with the Monk and the Rogue, I came in to help backstop Jason, and for the Summoner as well, in different ways. So let's talk about each of them. So the Unchained Monk is very interesting, because the Monk itself, the Pathfinder 1st Edition Monk, no archetypes, nothing, just the core rulebook, it had a lot of problems. It's trying to do a lot of things, it had a lot of abilities, but they didn't always really synergize very well. So, and I see a comment here from D. Caldemeyer that says, Pathfinder Unchained showcases some of the bones of PF2, great job from the entire team and their work on the project. Well, thank you. It was very exciting. I was so thrilled to have a book like this as like my first book, since books like Unearthed Arcana were always some of my favorites in D&D. So being able to do a variant book, I love it. Also, then I got to do Occult Adventures after that. It was really great. Especially those first two were kind of a 1-2 combo, which was really awesome. So speaking of 1-2 combos, the monk was trying to do a lot of things in the core rulebook. Did some of them, but it really wasn't flexible. Like, you got what you got, and you better like it. Archetypes helped with trading some of those things away, and because the core chassis was weak, there were a lot of overpowered archetypes for the Pathfinder, just the regular first edition monk. I guess you could call it the chained monk, but it's mostly just the core rulebook monk. Had a lot of overpowered archetypes, which maybe it wasn't a bad thing that they were overpowered, because the monk was not doing what it needed to do. Though in another way, it made the game a lot less approachable, because it was like, well, you could play what's in this book and be bad, or hopefully you found these other books that make you not be bad. The Unchained Monk was an attempt to fix that. And it actually was the one of these that went through the most iterations in design. Because Jason kept coming back with these really interesting designs for the monk, but then I think first he brought back one and it did combos. It had a headbutt and punches and kicks and elbows, and just like it had an attack routine, kind of like Claw Claw Bite. And it was an attempt to make this whole business with unarmed strike and natural attack and weapons being three separate things, to condense it down to two separate things, where it was in a natural attack based build. The problem was that it wasn't actually delivering the numbers that really that Jason was hoping that it would. And every time we went through and I made a spreadsheet and we looked at it, and it was like, no, there's not really a way to get it to do the same things, because the way Flurry was built for the original monk was pretty different. So eventually, after 3 different iterations, Jason came across the current Unchained Monk's core chassis, and pretty much as you see it in Unchained, I made a few adjustments based on what I had discovered from the various analyses of it. And then he had me fill out some of the extra key powers, which I took from some of my favorite archetypes, as well as just some interesting ideas, some of which were a little bit less combat-y, in case you wanted some non-combat narrative abilities for the monk. And one of the things that were added in at about that point where it switched out of natural attacks were the style strikes, which were a huge hit pretty much immediately. So that's about it for the process of the Unchained Monk. I think that most people didn't know how many iterations it went through, but it took a lot of work and a lot of effort to get the Unchained Monk, and I'm pretty proud of it. Even though initially, when the internet read the Unchained Monk, and a lot of people compared it to the most powerful archetype combination from the original Monk with all the most powerful extra abilities that you could no longer take, and of course, if you compare a baseline class to the most powerful combination of various other options, what do you expect? But over time, it's come to be a consensus that the Unchained Monk drastically reduced the number of extra sources you needed to get an effective monk, while also delivering that sort of martial arts flavor that everyone likes with the monk, and more flexibility on the monk. Alright, so what about the rogue? The rogue is probably the one out of these where I did the most, by a significant amount. And part of that is connected to another one of the sections that we're going to get to later. But first of all, just like I filled in the key powers, they started out by having me fill in some of the rogue talents. Jason knew that he was going to be adding debilitating injury. Like, that was his first thing that he knew would fix a lot of the math on the rogue, was debilitating injury. And then we powwowed together and all decided that we pretty much had to put in finesse training at that point to get it to work out. There were a lot of other ways to get dex to damage, and that's just how it shook out. So that alone did a lot of what you needed, and you'll see that the having better rogue talents, because rogue talents were just about the only talents type abilities that were worse than getting a feat on average before. Most of them were better than a feat. And not having finesse training like it did before, and debilitating injury, adding those did a lot of what we needed to do. But the problem was that the rogue is supposed to be a skills class, and really, even in the core rulebook, and especially afterwards, so many different classes just stamp all over that. Versatile performance makes the bard have more skill points than the rogue, just flat out, after a very short period of time. And there's a lot of other reasons that classes could do a lot of things with skills. So, one of the other sections that they had me working on before I was on the rogue was skill unlocks. And those were initially sort of pitched in the outline as being something like one of the options that's in the book, where it says, well, you could just give these to everybody if you feel like it, was sort of one of the initial ideas. And then I said, what if we give more of these to the rogue for free, and then we make it so that other people who take it, it's not so much as a freebie option. And that was something that created the ability, which is on the Unchained Rogue, called Rogue's Edge, and gave some extra skills-based talents, because Jason had already pretty much known how to fix the combat problems that the class had before we even went into this book. And so lastly is the Summoner. So on the Summoner, well, it's for the APG, so that's not even a class that like Jason was converting from 3.5. That was just one he had straight up had built for the APG. So, and he immediately knew what he wanted to do. First and foremost was the fact that he wanted to use the spell list he had always intended, which had somehow, like, apparently the APG was this book. It was so long, and Jason was by himself on the team at that point for the entire book, and just, he left after he was like, it's done, finally! And the spell list never got updated to the one that he had for there. Whoops. So the Unchained Summoner, he knew he wanted to use the spell list that he had intended from the Summoner based on playtest feedback that the playtest spell list had issues. And there were a lot of people in the office, especially James, who really, really wanted to see the Eidolon tied to the world so it could be more part of a story. And Jason would always, at conventions and other panels, they talk about, well, otherwise the Eidolon is just something with 12 butts and 15 tentacles. But basically make it more tied to the world, tied to the many outsider families that were around. And all of those adjustments, Jason just pretty much knew he wanted to do, and he did them right away. What I was called in to do was to help create some of the Eidolon subtypes and some of the flavor text on the different Eidolon subtypes, and that was a lot of fun. Taking the example of Angel and just spreading it out, seeing what might be different for some of the other Eidolons, and that was pretty cool. Summoner, a class shrouded in table contention, says D. Caldemeyer. That's true. And you know, the Summoner is not the topic of this stream, but why not do some design chat while we're in Design's Diary? Some people online have contended that, well, the Summoner can't possibly cause table problems because it's not a 9-level spellcaster, and their 9-level spellcaster should be causing more table problems since they have higher level spells which have their own issues. The problem with this contention is based on the way table and group dynamics work. So when you have a 9-level spellcaster with, let's say, some crazy teleport that they have very early on, or some kind of utility spell, the group as a whole might consider that they decided, even though the spellcaster is the one who prepared or cast it, that they needed that teleport in that slot. It depends on how sort of self versus community each of the players and each of the characters is. And a lot of the times, those 9-level spellcasters feel like they're doing something that's a group effort. Especially since there's a lot of buffs that are very powerful for spellcasters, and those inherently work real great, because the spellcaster casts the powerful buff. Who are they buffing? The other characters, and everybody's happy, right? While the summoner is a little different. The problem with the summoner is that it's both a source and a sink of those buff spells. Summoner has really good buff spells, and many people claim that, well, the Eidolon is just too much better than a martial character. It really isn't. But buff spells are very powerful in Pathfinder 1st Edition. So pretty much any buffed martial character is better than a non-buffed character. Even a core rogue who have a lot of issues in combat can be devastating with the right buffs on them. Like a bard on the team just completely gets rid of their accuracy problem. Eidolons were usually seen in combat very buffed, because the class of Summoner, unlike the class of Wizard, comes with both a source of buffs, the Summoner, and a sink of buffs, the Eidolon, that wants to receive the buffs. And so, therefore, you're having one player who's playing them both is getting both sides of the glory on that, as opposed to when the Wizard buffs the fighter and two players are having fun. And that's one reason why the Summoner was more disruptive at tables than a Wizard might have been. And D. Caldemeyer says the Eidolon Tides really helped the class. I agree. I think that the Eidolon Tides were really cool. Eidolon Tides, and I'm often saying that Kineticist utility versus the blast shapes and the form and substance infusions was one of the first times we really went into putting things in lanes. But the Eidolon types were a great way to think about putting things in lanes, due to the fact that we gave you more evolution points worth of stuff, but you couldn't put it all into offense and more attacks and kill everything, because they came pre-built with certain other options. And Steve Geddes says, cool, I never thought of that before. Hi, Steve, welcome. Yes, that is, it's a way that I came to think about it, because I was wondering why summoners were causing so much more grief than a lot of other classes, especially since not only had I playtested a summoner in Linda's Council of Thieves game, which also had a core rogue that was doing okay, although we did have a bard, but I even built like a pouncing cat named Mr. Kitty was my Eidolon. So it wasn't like I was holding back with the Eidolon, but I never seemed to be really upstaging everybody else, and it was mostly because I buffed the other characters a lot. And it wasn't that I built a weaker Eidolon. It wasn't that I built a weaker summoner. It's just that Eidolon lends itself, a summoner Eidolon lend itself to both, to taking all the attention of the buffs from the spellcaster and not giving it to the rest of the group, and it's gonna upstage. Alright. So that's basically a lot about Unchained Summoner. I also note that I helped with the evolutions, such as saying Pounce needs to cost more points. Having played that Pounce Kitty, we all know that it needed to cost more points. So that's mostly it for the classes. So does anybody have any questions about the classes? If not, I'm going to move on to the rest of that chapter, which is the math. Alright. So there were basically two things in the math chapter. In the math section of that chapter. The first one is fractional base bonuses. Fractional base bonuses is a pretty simple idea. You guys, if you've seen the book, have seen that. And it's basically saying, hey, if we don't want you to get screwed over by switching into a multi-class or a prestige class at the wrong time, so we'll turn the fractional advancement that underlies the math into actual fractions that you can add together. It's pretty simple. I did the math for that. It did not take very long, and it's honestly pretty similar to any other fractional advancement that you've probably seen before. Alright, actually there is a question about the classes. What class do you feel should have been included in the book? Well, I feel like that the Summoner definitely should have been in there, the Monk and the Rogue definitely should have been in there, and honestly, like, Jason and Steven in particular had a lot of data about why the Barbarian needed to be in there based on people trying to learn the Barbarian and the way that it worked out. So it seemed like all the classes that were in there should have been in there. But if you mean like, what if we had extra pages and we got to do another Unchained class? Well, probably I would say the Cavalier or the Fighter. Just because the Cavalier just wasn't necessarily all that it could be. Although, on the other hand, I guess as we found out in the playtest for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, maybe the Cavalier's real role was not to be a class, because a lot of people were very happy to see it as an archetype. Whereas Fighter, I feel like, is a great class concept that was sort of anchored to the fact that all it does is get feats at a faster rate that other people could get. And Steve hits the nail on the head when he says the Fighter seems simple, but actually takes a bit more thinking. Exactly. It seems like, oh, it doesn't have that many features. This is the class I should give to a newbie. But really, that means it's the class where everything you get has to depend on crazy combinations of feats taken out of hundreds of possible feats. So, therefore, really, it's maybe one of the most complicated to build in Pathfinder 1st Edition, unless you use a guide, like my Guide to Fighters or something, that tells you which feats you need to take. There's a lot of other classes that at least build in stuff for you. Like with a Barbarian, even if you forget to take Power Attack, you're still a Barbarian. With a Fighter, if you just take rando stuff that's not going to help you, you're kind of a warrior at that point. So that's not good. So I would say probably Fighter would be the one I would add on. And in fact, you'll see later on that I did come up with a way during making this book to give Fighters something a little bit Unchained that was from the Unchained book, because I thought there should be something for Fighters in here, and there wasn't at the start. So then there's Staggered Advancement. Staggered Advancement is pretty simple as well, and we got that in from a freelance author, and it was pretty good. It just basically says, hey, what if you split each level into 4 levels, and you gave only some of the stuff at each of these levels, so that you didn't have to gain as much all at once. And it pretty much works like you said on the tin. Like it said on the tin. I looked at it, but I didn't do super a lot with Staggered Advancement. So, for the purpose of this design diary, I'm going to sort of skip past it, give you more behind the scenes deets about some other stuff. So the skills chapter is next. The skills chapter was very much Logan's domain in this book, and he did so many amazing things with the skills. This was just basically where he was always taking the lead. And I would say also the monsters chapter, not because Logan developed the monster chapter, but because he actually wrote it as one of the 2 freelancers and the main freelancer of the monster chapter, and sent it in to us. So between those two, you see a lot of cool things that Logan came up with. The background skills was just something very popular that was a huge house rule among a lot of GMs at the time. That was, hey, some skills aren't as good, so just give them for free to go with the PC's background. And of course, there was the consolidated skills, which you'll see we consolidated skills as well in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so a little bit of a sneak preview of ways to combine the skills. And then the one that comes after that was the grouped skills, where you learn a group and you get all the skills that are in that group, as well as some alternate crafting and profession. That was a good sort of primer for some of the major crafting and profession changes that we had to make for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And I think in 2nd Edition we really got it right, where you don't just make 100 times more money for being making a magic item. So Steve asks if I have cheering disabled. So Steve, as it turns out, you came at just the right time. This is our very last stream, after which we will hit affiliate. So this community is not an affiliate community right now. It therefore cannot cheer, no emoji, and a bunch of other stuff that we don't have. We're about to get it. So I would always be grateful for cheers, and also the Streamlabs link that is at the bottom that you can turn on has an XP tracker that does allow direct donations via streamlabs.com. There's a link and it goes directly to my PayPal, and that also adds XP. But very, very soon we will have cheering, and I know that's way more convenient for most people. So I'm pretty excited about that because I want people to be able to earn some more XP, and I'm going to put up some more goodies and rewards on the show as well. Alright, so let's see. After that, in the skills chapter, was something that I worked on pretty primary, and that's skill unlocks. I sort of spoiled this beforehand. We already got pretty good skill unlocks from the freelancer right away, who I think was Jason Nelson. Not totally positive. It was 5 years ago. And I adjusted them and just sort of turned them into the free rogue thing, and then you take a feat if you want it if you're not a rogue. Because before, it just had the idea of take a feat or give it out, and giving it out for free is in there. But I wanted to give something to rogues to just give the idea. Rogues are great. They have their own thing with skills. This, I guess, and I am rogue Eidolon, but this would sort of be a theme for me of trying to make sure that the rogue class, or the one that's supposed to be the skill class, is in fact actually the most skilled. It's easy to get that to not happen. In Starfinder, there are at least 2 separate instances where the operative almost became not the most skilled class in the game. Where I said, well, we've just added a lot of skills to other things. Are we really going to make the operative have 10 skills to be the most skilled in the game? Or are we going to give up on it being the most skilled in the game? Are we going to drop that other thing that we just added? I thought we were going to drop the other thing we just added, to be honest. But no, okay, yeah, I can have 10 skills. And not what I expected, but super cool. And the operative is really great at skills now, and definitely is the best at skills in Starfinder. So, mission accomplished. And you can send any of your operative hate for it being too good to me, because that's one of my 2 classes from Starfinder. Let's see. In my current Reign of Winter campaign, D. Caldemeyer says, we're using background skills and innate item bonuses for neck, ring, and shoulder slots only. And Steve says, it's hard not to outshine other PCs in what they do if you're playing an operative. Well, in skills, at least, I know operatives got a very late stage nerf, even after the last time I had seen them, to their very early game damage. So the ones I've played are actually and I wanted to play the operative because I love the operative, but I was really bad in combat, and I think I will be for the first 4 levels, because they started with a D8 to their trick attack initially, and with a D4, which I don't always get because I'm first level. My operatives, I played one operative in a one-shot Jason Keeley ran of his PFS adventure, and then one on I want to say Roll for Combat on their stream, and I was not very useful in combat yet, but I think I would be very good starting at level 5. But yeah, in skills, the operative is the best in skills. It's hard to do that in a system where everyone is so good in skills. It requires being absurd in skills, even stronger than I initially had them, just because everyone else was pushing the envelope, so they pushed as well. So, Starfinder's side, let's go to variant multiclassing. I feel like variant multiclassing is the thing that was in this book that took the rest of the design team the most by surprise that it was as popular as it was, because it kept being sort of something that was mentioned as a side thing, and then everyone was latching on to, and they were like, why is everyone latching on to this? And I think just ultimately the idea of having 2 classes in an easy fashion is very appealing to people. And Gestalt was very appealing to people in 3.5 The Earth Arcana. Just having a way to do it where you don't divert your main class. And ultimately that led towards a I would say, much better implemented because it was built in the ground up, Pathfinder 2nd Edition multiclassing. But what variant multiclassing sort of taught in Unchained, when I was tinkering around with it, was that some of the classes I just found, like, certain, maybe weaknesses is the wrong word, but idiosyncrasies with just, like, what does this class give? What can I give you that I'm not just making you way better than a single class character of this class? And we had a freelance turnover, and it was a start, but it didn't have all of the classes. But like Gunslinger, if you give gun training, the gig is up. And if you don't give gun training, there's not that much to give. There's firearms, there's gunsmith, there's deeds, but the Gunslinger, particular, the variant multiclass, was not really that powerful. They tended to be a feat, or maybe a little bit better than a feat, because they cost a feat each. They're very restricted in when you have to take the feats. And you wound up getting a lot more with some of the other multi-classes, depending on which one you picked and when. So it also taught a little bit about class design based on which ones were easier to turn into a variant multi-class. And it's just one that took off in people talking about it, especially when Unchained was out. Everybody who was everybody knew the classes were going to be the most talked about thing, and they were. But variant multi-classing being the second, I think it made it the surprise hit. And the idea of being able to get two classes, and some people just gave them variant multi-classing for free, or those kind of tweaks, is something that I'm not going to forget moving forward. And therefore, we are not going to forget in products moving forward. And certainly it led towards 2E multi-classing. Alright, so what about the gameplay chapter? So the gameplay chapter has some really interesting sections. The alignment section, the first alignment section, and that's the one with the affirmations, was something that Steven was really passionate about, and he wrote himself, because he's a philosophy guy. Like, he legitimately has a philosophy degree, and he likes talking and thinking about this stuff, and it's really super cool. I didn't have much to do with that. There is something in the alignment session that's going to be my first real thing where I say, I just added this to this book. So let's see, hold on. There is a question here from D.R. Nielsen. So classes and the thing most related to classes. Yes, in fact, classes and the thing most related to classes were the most popular. Who'da thunk? So after alignment, removing alignment. That was something that was not on the initial outline, and I just said, I really think we should put something in here about removing alignment. And so we did. We have a 2-page section I wrote about removing alignment. Also, fun piece of trivia, and I'll show you this picture as well, but you guys might remember the picture in the removing alignment section. Well, I brought my book with me, so if you don't, you can see it. Let's see if this works. Let's see if this is visible. I'm on a little bit of delay here. Here we go. So, here we see Sela, and it's Burning Orphanage versus Anti-Paladin's Castle with the Anti-Paladin hiding behind it. So, yeah, I ordered this piece of art because it was funny, but this piece of art was maybe a nail that a straw that broke the camel's back type situation, but it led to us starting to order something called a full body plus from artists, where it's a full body, but then there's also some other stuff that's in there due to the fact that the artist had to do so many things, and we only ordered a full body for it. Whoops. It turned out really great, though. So, mea culpa on that one. The next part of Unchained, the revised action economy, was, of course, a preview of Pathfinder 2nd Edition's action economy. Even at the time we wrote Unchained, like, we knew this was probably Pathfinder 2nd Edition's action economy. And Steven wrote it up also for Unchained. It doesn't work as much for Pathfinder 1st Edition, just because of the fact that, well, 1st Edition has its own kind of very specific and idiosyncratic pieces of action economy that fit together in a bizarre way and are sometimes just required for a certain class to not be terrible. Like, some classes are built around the assumption that they're doing crazy things with their swift action every round or else. And suddenly, if that costs one of your attacks compared to other classes, then you've thrown the class balance a little bit out of whack. So, in that sense, the revised action economy didn't necessarily do everything, but as a start, it was just a very clean system. We knew we would have needed 5 times that many pages if we wanted to actually put in enough specifications to make it work completely with every corner case, and we didn't have that. So we gave a few examples. Some people online started really liking it and making their own adjustments for every single corner case that would have taken 5 times as many pages, and that was really exciting for us because we knew that that meant that there were a lot of people who liked it a lot and would like a system that was based around it a lot. And we now have a system that's based around that, and it's pretty cool. Another statement from Dr. Nielsen, that or your full attack is important like Magus. Yes, that's true. With Magus, get the ability to generate additional action economy for yourself was pretty important. Of course, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you could just always attack and cast a spell, so you're kind of like a Magus from the get-go, which is pretty cool. There's obviously a few extra things you would want to add on. So, removing iterative attacks was maybe, to me, one of the sections that perplexed me when I was just starting, because it was one of the very first things that was assigned to me, was just like, figure something else for this, we don't have anything. And I came up with a very simplistic system, which you can see in the book. And I said, I don't know if this is going to do anything that we want. This is the first thing I came up with. Let's iterate. And then all 3 of the other designers said, oh no, that was fine. That's pretty much what we want. And so it went into the book. And so it was just sort of my first initial spitball on the topic. I was expecting, and in many other areas, there were, we used heavily iterative design with lots of passes, each different person doing something. But on this one, it was like, no, that's fine. It's got the same expected value. It's only one roll. We'll do it. It does the right amount of damage. We'll do removing iterative attacks. So that was kind of interesting. We have from Steve, the 3 action economy has got to be the most popular feature of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Everybody seems to cite it as one of their top 3. Yeah, it's definitely very popular. I know that degrees of success are very popular too. I feel like that the action economy is very flashy, is likely to get cited. Degrees of Success is a workhorse that doesn't get cited as often, but that to me is one of the standout ways that we can improve gameplay dramatically. It's just, even if you just took Pathfinder 1st Edition, created Degrees of Success, and banished the your character doesn't get to play to the critical failure on saving throws, you've suddenly made so many parts of Pathfinder 1st Edition more fun. Because who wants to be out of the fight? Like, one time at a Pathfinder Society table, I was stunned for like 2 hours in game, and the GM knew that and told me to go get lunch early. Like, it can easily happen to you in Pathfinder 1st Edition, less so in 2nd Edition, and that is one of several really cool things that the Degrees of Success can do. And honestly, Pathfinder 1st Edition always had Degrees of Success, like on the skills where you fail by 5 or more and something weird happens. Just wasn't regimented or explained in a way where you just kind of expect it. And many people would forget particular ones. So stamina and combat tricks, in addition to the action economy, were both huge sections, and they're both places where they sucked up Steven's time in the same way that skills were where Logan was at for a lot of Unchained. And you can see how enormous stamina and combat tricks is. Because it has a special effect for every combat feat. So initially this was only presented as an idea of, well, there's a feat you can take to get these combat tricks. And the one thing, other than the fact that this was so big that Logan and I both did a pass on these for consistency, because Steven had created some sort of guidelines as he went along of like these ones that give you an extra action are like 5 points, and these ones that do these other things are cost 2 stamina points, and so on. And we did a consistency pass, but also I added on the part where to give the options of free for fighters or fighter bonus feat only and free for everyone, because I wanted there to be something that you could do an Unchained fighter if you wanted to. You could do free for fighters, and then that gives fighters something unique if you want that option. And that seemed fairly popular among people who use stamina. I don't know how many people actually use stamina in the end of the day. But stamina is a pretty cool add-on that can be very interesting in that it has a sort of anti-lever against the rush by minute per levels. And that can lead to some interesting gameplay. So Wound Threshold is another interesting one where, once again, we wound up getting something that was a little bit too complicated to use. And so I, once again, spitballed a very preliminary, simplistic starter point and was like, what can we add to this? And everyone was like, just like with iterative attacks, this is pretty good, let's just do this. And Wound Threshold is that. And it's basically when you're below a certain amount of your hit points, basically 3/4 or lower, bad death spirally things start happening to you until eventually you're really screwed. And it's a much grittier style of play, and of course the grittier mode at the end is one of the other options I presented when I first gave it, is with double the penalties. And oh boy, that one's pretty interesting because it means that a spellcaster consistently can't cast their top level of spells if your archer goes first and pops a shot at them, which really changes the dynamics of the game into a heal heavy sort of meta where you need to keep the spellcasters topped off so that they can pull out their most dangerous tricks. Alright, so the last section of this chapter is perhaps the most special section of them all. Diseases and poison. So, I told you that I was allowed to add extra things to the outline. And in fact, we got a lot of pages back because, to be honest with you, we'll see this in the magic items section. Initially, what would become the automatic item bonuses, what we asked for, and the freelancers absolutely gave us what we asked for, but it just maybe wasn't a good use of page space, was a whole bunch of items that were just items that had the automatic item bonuses in them. And once we got it in, we realized maybe it would be better to just give a short section explaining how to do the automatic item bonuses for every item in the game, which not only gives you all the items, but then does not take huge amounts of space. So we had a lot of pages left. And this last section on disease and poison were in fact the 4 pages that we had left in the book when everything else was said and done. And before I get into exactly what happened next, I'm going to answer a question from D. Caldemeyer. It says, do you see PF2 needing a book such as Pathfinder Unchained, or do you feel its design space doesn't quite warrant such revisions to establish classes? So, I'm going to say, D. Caldemeyer, that I'm going to say, like, yes and yes, or no and no. Like, I think that your question implies that needing Pathfinder Unchained was mainly because we needed revisions to establish classes. And while that is the thing people talked about the most, I think that that is not why we needed Pathfinder Unchained. It was good to have it in there because those classes had issues that needed to be resolved, and certainly it's what people will think about first. But I think that having a book of options and ways to tweak your game, ways to make the game work for your group, is hugely crucial and important, and something that even a Game Mastery Guild style product should at least give us a little bit of information about. Because part and parcel of being a group that's doing tabletop role-playing is the flexibility to make things work well for your group. So I don't think that there's going to be a need for major revisions to established classes, but I do think that we absolutely need this style of stuff, and not just halfway through the cycle of the game like Pathfinder Unchained. We need it early, and we need to make it clear this is one of the principles we use to design Pathfinder 2nd Edition, is to design a game where it's easier to do this. So in some ways, maybe you won't need as much of a Pathfinder Unchained, because some of the things we did in here, you'll just be empowered to do on your own. But elements that made it into Unchained, I think, should definitely be available quickly and freely available for everybody. So basically my answer is sideways orthogonal answer. Alright, let's move back to diseases and poisons. So diseases and poisons, the book was all outlined. We all knew what was going on. We had 4 pages left. I actually asked Linda what was the one thing that she would be most likely to... She just didn't like how it worked in Pathfinder. And she said diseases and poisons. And she explained why she didn't like them was that you had tons of recalculation of stuff from your ability scores. Ability damage and drain didn't exactly work the same as having your ability go down. A lot of the time, it didn't do anything to you, or it just didn't matter, and it took a bunch of rolls. Wasn't very evocative. So hence disease and poisons were born, which wound up being used as like the main system for Starfinder, and a lot of the ideas of different stages are absolutely in 2nd edition as well. So that's all thanks to Linda not liking poisons and diseases. And if you like these diseases and poisons, I know some of my Facebook fans did, and I converted all of the core rulebook poisons into this system several years ago on my Facebook page. Alright, so we've only got a little bit left now. There's the magic, and there's the monsters. So I'm actually going to skip to the monsters first, since we're going pretty well on this. There's a lot of content here. I want to make sure we talk about the monsters. So the monster system that you see in Pathfinder Unchained is the brainchild of Logan, and Rob Schwab helped with a lot of filling in some of the cool ideas. I think he did a lot of like the spell templates as well. And basically the idea is you can graph things on. You have your expected numbers, which are just like the ones from the bestiary, except for taking into account if you're making a full attack that has a lower accuracy, that you need to have different damage than if everything's at the highest accuracy bonus. And basically, this was our first take at a top-down design system for monsters. Now, what do I mean by top-down? Well, a top-down approach means that you start by saying, what is a cool thing that this monster can do? What's my concept for the monster? What role do I want it to fill? How is it going to be awesome? And then, from there, you figure out what to do. Now, obviously, Pathfinder 1st Edition Bestiary and this system both have a giant lookup chart. So, they're fundamental pieces that are the same. But the difference is that the regular system in Pathfinder Bestiary 1st Edition is a bottom-up approach. That means I've got all these details, like the number of hit dice I have, and what is the base attack bonus of a dragon, and I calculate all of those details, and then whatever I have at the end is my monster. And the problem with bottom-up approach is that there's a lot of times it doesn't give you what you want, and then you just have to fake it with tons of fake-out things, like the imps plus racial bonus on saving throw DCs, or giving something an enormously high strength because it's very, very big and not very high level. So there are a lot of advantages to a top-down design approach, and this was the first one we had of it. You will see, if you take a close look at it, that basically it's pretty much the same as the monster creation system that Logan wrote for the Starfinder monster creation system. And Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a little bit different from both of them. It doesn't necessarily use graphs as much, but they're all top-down approaches, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the top-down approach. My role on this was mostly to look through and confab with Logan and do little tweaks, But basically what he had submitted to us was just, he and Rob had submitted to us was just very solid right away. Also, we had to both write some of the sample monsters. Plus the terrace that didn't make it in. Because why not build the terrace using top-down? I'll tell you, it didn't take as long as it usually does to build a monster of that level. So that was cool. And I know not that many people use that monster building section, but I know a lot of people, like one of the third-party publishers, Dale McCoy, started using it to build monsters and always was saying a lot of good things about it when he started building some monsters. Alright, so the last section is magic. So the magic section really was not only a grab bag in terms of what went in there in the end, because as I told you, we removed a lot of items that were just, this item is resistance bonus and also this other bonus. But there are just a lot of very different sections, and it wound up with a lot of space. So we each did some really cool things in here. So simplified spellcasting was what Jason wanted most from this section, because it just, you always have so many spells, and I agree with Jason, like, my Rise of the Runelords game that I ran in Pathfinder 1st Edition literally took them 3 hours to do all the spell preparation and buffs that they did before the final fight with Karzuk. I'm not kidding. So, the idea of, well, it's simplified and you don't have as many of the lower level spells, but you can spontaneously have the ones that you need, is pretty compelling. I think that it didn't get as much play as it maybe could have, just because people who were looking at it being like, oh, I wonder if this is simplified and super boosting my power of spellcasting, looked at it and found, yeah, this gives me fewer spells. I don't like that. And it was not intended to necessarily buff spellcasters. In fact, a lot of the spellcasting things here that aren't magic items were not. But it certainly is a way to do things more simply than Pathfinder 1st Edition's core system. And I didn't really do very much on there, so we'll move on to spell alterations. Spell alterations is a section that, as well as esoteric components, is another Logan section that basically Logan worked on those. I don't really have much behind the scenes to say about them, except there's some super cool ideas in there. Alright. Automatic bonus progression. This is perhaps the quintessential thing from this book that people know that I added to this book, because they asked me about it a lot when it first came out. And this was something that I was pretty surprised was not going to be in the book, because so many people want to play a low magic game. And so I pushed for it and didn't have to push hard. It was immediately accepted and created the automatic bonus progression. And it's since become pretty popular. I still maintain that the way that I handled weapons and armor on the blog, while mathematically more difficult, is probably more satisfying. And certainly the people who looked at the math and all said, wait, this seems like there's some things that are a little weird with the math on the weapons and armor. If you're like that, I recommend finding the blog. It's the one with the, I think, the flump shooting laser beams. And there's a chart on there, and use that for weapons and armor. Other than that, things came at pretty good levels, and they free you up to buy cool stuff. Innate item bonuses is the other side of that, and as I sort of spoiled earlier on, basically, Logan and I worked together to take what was a ridiculously long section full of items that were just, this is a ring, and it has deflection bonus and its other ring thing, and condense it down to 2 pages that just told you, here's what you add, here's how much money to add. And it looks like, I think D. Caldemeyer said that he used that system, so I'm glad that it worked out. Alright, so scaling items are also pretty cool, because people have wanted items that go along with your character for a very long time. We actually got scaling items from several different freelancers, but we wound up adopting the approach of one of them. Can't remember which one, I think maybe it was Russ, who had the approach for the wonders, like different items that were either wonders or baubles or prizes. And you'll see those in the values of the scaling items that are in the beginning of this section. Yeah, there it is. And we basically converted all the other ones to be like that, plus added in some additional items just for fun. to fill things out, like let's see, I think the crystal tiara, or the heart of the elder tree, and the robe of the fairy queen, and some of those additional items that are in there. Alright, so dynamic magic item creation is undoubtedly the lengthiest and most complicated thing that I had added to this book. Basically, the Pathfinder First Edition item creation is maybe, as a subsystem, the least satisfying and most distorting subsystem that is in the game, just due to the fact that it doubles your wealth if you're playing a game like Kingmaker, and Linda had run us through Kingmaker in our home group, and you automatically succeed even if you try something really hard, because the DC is ridiculously easy, and it's really uninteresting, even though in Mythology it's really interesting to create a magic item. So basically, based on my home groups, we had our own house rule, but it was very boring, and it just gave a failure chance and made it less broken, but was also still unsatisfying. Came up with these idea of special challenges that would make it more like making the Sampo in the Kalevala, or any of those other myths of like they made the really cool item and all of these special tasks. And this one was a lot of fun to work on, just come up with ideas, try to get it explained in a really good way, and I really couldn't have gotten it into the state where it's as easy to understand it as it is, actually, without the help of Ryan Macklin, who was one of the editors at Paizo at the time, but also like a game designer of a bunch of indie games. And he was my editor for this section, or my first one, and he looked through some of the descriptions of the initial system and helped out a lot with some of the wording of that. And if you like dynamic item creation, then yeah, that's just something that I added on to the book. Alright. Well, I'm super glad that we got up to 13 people in like the last minute, and welcome for like the very, very end of the show to these extra people. So first I'm going to say goodbye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube!